Now, in ordinary life, anger, for example, as such an internal action, is located in the liver. Plato even assigns the liver something still higher, something which is even regarded by some as the highest function of all, that is prophesying, or the gift of speaking of holy and eternal things in a non-rational manner. But the movement which the individual has in his liver, heart, and so on cannot be regarded as wholly reflected into itself. Rather, it is present in such a manner that it has already taken on a corporeal aspect in him and has an animal existence turning outward to external reality. Hegel in paragraph 326 proposes for us one possible contender for being that organ that is mediating between the spiritual individuality, what we might call our spiritual consciousness, and all the other organs of the body. And he talks about the liver. So, that seems probably a bit strange to the late modern reader, because we don't think of the liver doing much other than helping us to digest things, and every once in a while getting injured and causing us problems, right? So why talk about the liver? Well, he tells you, a few things here. He says, in ordinary life, anger, for example, as such an internal action, is located in the liver. People, we know this isn't the case now, although getting angry a lot isn't good for your liver, I suppose, any more than it's good for other parts of your body. But, this is a common view that you could localize particular emotions or affects in terms of the humors that were going on. And the liver produces one of the humors, the cholos, the bile, right? And melancholia, black bile disease, was closely connected with anger. In any case, what are we talking about here? So Hegel is saying, look, with this, maybe there is that reflexive relation going on. And anger maybe is, if you think about the way anger works as an emotion, it is self-regarding. It has to do with the relationship, not just of, stimulus to your response, but rather of a perception of wrong being done. So there's already moral conceptions. There's interrelations with other people. So perhaps that's, something, a good contender for something that would be, in fact, spiritual, geistige, right? In the Hegelian sense. Furthermore, he says Plato associated the liver with something yet higher. This is kind of a backhanded compliment, though. He says, which is regarded by some people as the highest function of all. Not by Hegel, by the way. But some people thought that sort of an unmediated relationship to the divine, around the time that he's writing, was the best thing that you should be going after. These are the people who stressed intuition. You remember back to Hegel's criticisms of intuition in the preface. So he goes on and he says, Plato, said that it had to do with prophesying, or the gift of speaking of holy and eternal things in a non-rational manner. Now, what's the problem here? The liver is not going to be a suitable candidate, neither is the heart, which is another organ that people sometimes when they're thinking about the body would like to associate with, that's where my emotions lie. We engage in all this metaphorical stuff, and I think some people really do think that the human heart is this locus of the person. Why not locate it, say, in the pancreas or in the tip of your finger? Well, these organs are supposed to be doing some sort of unifying task. So Hegel says, why doesn't this work? He says, the movement which the individual has in his liver, heart, and so on cannot be regarded as wholly reflected into itself. Why not? Even if it's partially reflected into itself, it's also focused on external reality. So if we take anger for an example, so anger is self-regarding, and it does have to do not only with your own view of yourself, but your view of yourself in relation to other people, and moral obligations or expectations, all that sort of stuff. That's true. But it is primarily doing something out there in the world. And so Hegel's saying it's somewhat reflective, but it's not what we're looking for here. So he says, the movement cannot be regarded as wholly reflected into itself. Rather, it is present in such a manner that it has already taken on a corporeal aspect in him and has an animal existence turning outwards to external reality. And again, anger, great example. Anger can stem from a lot of rational considerations, but it is, in many respects, an animal-like response. And you might think of Epictetus, for example, observing that when we give in to anger and we're just totally out of control, we're like wild beasts. We're like the beasts of prey, not like sheep and nice things that basically just want to eat and copulate, and that's a whole problem by itself. Not like little clever foxes, but more like lions and wolves that want to tear into the other people, the rest of the world, sometimes even ourselves if we get angry enough. So the liver is not going to work as a candidate. So what will? That's where we have to go next. The nervous system, on the other hand, is the immediate repose of the organism in its movement. The nerves themselves, it is true, are again the organs of that consciousness which is already immersed in its outward directed activity. Brain and spinal cord, however, may be considered as the immediate presence of self-consciousness. A presence which abides within itself, is not objective, and also does not look outwards. Insofar as the moment of being which this organ has is a being for another, that is an outer existence, it is a dead thing and no longer the presence of self-consciousness. This being within itself, however, is by its very nature a fluid system in which the circles cast into it immediately dissolve and in which no lasting distinction is expressed. Meanwhile, as spirit itself is not abstractly simple, but a system of movements in which it differentiates itself into moments, but in this very differentiation remains free, and as spirit articulates its body into a variety of functions and allots one particular part for only one function, so too the fluid being of its being within self can be thought of as articulated into parts. And it seems that it must be thought of in this way, because the being of spirit, which in the brain is reflected into itself, is itself again only a middle term between spirit's pure essence and its corporeal articulation, a middle term which therefore must partake of the nature of both. The corporeal aspect must therefore also be present in the middle term in the form of immediate being. In 326, Hegel had ruled out several different organs as possible contenders for having that kind of circularity or reflexivity of being what mediates the parts of the body, the organs of the body, with something that is corporeal to a degree in its causality, but is not truly corporeal, which is spirit. Now he's going to let the cat out of the bag and say, okay, it's the nervous system, or at least part of the nervous system that is doing that work. And here we're getting something like a philosophy of mind in the sense that we're used to today. Hegel is going to view the nervous system as a whole as performing the function that we were just talking about. So he says the nervous system, on the other hand, is the immediate repose of the organism in its movement, which is a little bit of a strange way to talk about it. The repose of the individual in its movement, right? It's dynamic, right? The nervous system is able to take into account what's going on in the rest of the body. Now, he goes on and he says, the nerves themselves are the organs of that consciousness which is already immersed in its outward directed activity, right? So the nerves are, sort of a mediator to the rest of the body, and thereby to the external reality that lies outside of the scope of the body. So the nerves perform a function. The nerves are sort of channels of communication. They are not by themselves doing a lot of reflexive work, although feedback loops can be set up with them, I suppose. So he goes on and he says, brain and spinal cord may be considered as the immediate presence of self-consciousness. That's going to be a very important phrase. The immediate. presence of self-consciousness. Not all of self-consciousness is just what's going on in the brain or spinal cord. As a matter of fact, strictly speaking, self-consciousness from a Hegelian perspective is not even just located within the self. You can see that in the dialectic of self-consciousness at the beginning of that section. The other assumes a role, and so you lose, you might say, a part of yourself to the other. But put that aside for right now, because remember, we're back in the reason section. Reason is sure of itself. It's worked through all that stuff in self-consciousness. So how does it work for this? He says, brain and spinal cord may be considered as the immediate presence of self-consciousness, a presence which abides within itself, is not objective, and also does not look outwards insofar as it's considering itself. It says, insofar as the moment of being which this organ has is a being for another, that is an outer existence, it is a dead thing and no longer the presence of self-consciousness. Now that is a fascinating thing to say, because what does that mean? Insofar as the brain is primarily being looked at from the outside, say by dissection, or by doing brain surgery, or by doing experimentation on, as we did, the unfortunate survivors of head injuries in World War I, or, for example, using MRI imagery to try to say, oh, well, this is exactly what's going on, something is being lost. In the reduction of it to the objective, it turns the brain into just whatever, science, the natural science of today, can reveal it to be, which isn't its full being. So, interestingly, here's an implication. This is a bit of a digression here. If Hegel's correct in this, this means that the whole question of whether consciousness is reducible to the brain, or whether we have something like a Cartesian dualism where there's spirit and then the corporeal organ, that's kind of a non-starter actually within the Hegelian framework. Because of course you have an organ, but that organ itself can be understood in two ways. In an objective way, which treats it essentially as a dead thing, even if it treats it as a supposedly living system. And then the other way, which is to say it is infused with, or it is integrated with, spirit. And not just in high-performing individuals, everybody. So he goes on. Now, consider that too, another digression. Hegel has no problem with a sort of evolutionary perspective on the development of human being and all that. At a certain point, we get a creature whose brain function is able to be a sufficient vehicle for spirit, for Geist, for something that we could never guess would have come on the scene. And we get to know, sort of, according to Hegel, after the fact, after it's gone through its process of development. Keep that. Think about that a bit. Anyway, going back to the brain and all that, he says, insofar as the moment of being which this organ has is a being for another, it's a dead thing, no longer the presence of self-consciousness. The being within itself, however, is by its very nature a fluid system in which the circles cast into it immediately dissolve. A nice little metaphor of throwing things into the pond and the circles disappear, and in which no lasting distinction is expressed. And that is what spirit, for the individual spirit, is. It's a fluid system, and it uses the brain to do so. Now, Hegel's using this term here, one that he doesn't use all that often, being within self. In sich selbst sein. He's not using an sich sein, in itself, being in itself, nor is he talking about für sich sein, being for itself, nor is he even saying, being for, in and for itself, right, an and für sich sein. He's saying in sich selbst sein. And I don't want to go overboard on this, but there's something that's worth pointing out here. There's what we might call a reflexive intensity going on here. Sich and Selbst here are both doing similar things. in sich, in itself. I mean, an sich would be in itself in the more proper sense, but in sich, in itself, selbst, what that is. So to have in sich selbst sein, being within itself, means to have a certain, what I just called reflexive intensity of being. That means that it has greater being. That means that because of that reflexive relation, it has greater being. This is a really tricky concept that Hegel is just sort of plowing through without explaining to us at this point. Let's go on and see where he's going, though. He says it was a fluid system. Meanwhile, as spirit itself is not abstractly simple, but a system of movements in which it differentiates itself into moments, but in this very differentiation remains free, and as spirit articulates its body into a variety of functions and allots one particular part for only one function, so too the fluid being of its being within self can be thought of as articulated into parts. Thought of. That doesn't mean that spirit actually does have parts, but it's got something analogous, what we might call functions. So he says, it seems it must be thought of in this way, because the being of spirit, which in the brain is reflected into itself, is again only a middle term between what? Spirit's pure essence over here, and the rest of the body and the outside world over here. Brain is a mediator. It is a connector, you might say, for spirit and the outside world. So he says it's a middle term, which therefore must partake of the nature of both. The corporeal aspect must therefore be present in the middle term in the form of immediate being. This is precisely why the brain can be viewed from a certain perspective as reducible to, say, its structures or its cells, or what can be revealed as areas of electrical activity. But there's more going on than just that in the way in which spirit is using or enframing itself with the brain. The spiritually organic being has at the same time the necessary aspect of an inert, enduring existence. The former, qua the extreme of being for self, must step back and have this latter as the other extreme over against it, which is then the object on which the spiritually organic being acts as cause. If now the brain and spinal cord together constitute that corporeal being for self of spirit, the skull and vertebral column form the other extreme to it, an extreme which is separated off, that is, the solid inert thing. When, however, anyone thinks of the proper location of spirit's outer existence, it is not the back that comes to mind, but only the head. Therefore, in examining a way of knowing like the one we are now dealing with, we can be satisfied with this reason, not a very bad reason in this case, in order to confine this existence to the skull. Should it occur to anyone to think of the back as the location of spirit, insofar as by it too knowing and doing are no doubt sometimes partly driven in and partly driven out, this would be no proof at all that the spinal cord must be taken as included in the indwelling seat of spirit, because this proves too much. For one may equally recall that there are other popular external ways, too, for getting at the activity of spirit in order to stimulate or inhibit it. The vertebral column is then rightly ruled out, if you like. That the skull alone does not contain the organs of spirit is as well explained as many another doctrine of philosophy of nature. For this was previously excluded from the notion of this relation, and for this reason the skull was taken for the aspect of outer existence. Or if we are not to be allowed to recall the notion of the relation, then certainly experience teaches that, as it is with the eye qua organ that we see, so it is not with the skull that we murder, steal, write poetry, and so forth. That is the reason why we must also refrain from using the expression organ for that significance of the skull which is still to be mentioned. For although it is commonly said that reasonable men pay attention not to the word but to the thing itself, yet this does not give us permission to describe a thing in terms inappropriate to it. For this is at once incompetence and deceit, to fancy and to pretend that one merely has not the right word, and to hide from oneself that really one has failed to get hold of the thing itself, that is, the notion. If one had the notion, then one would also have the right word. What has been determined here in the first instance is only that just as the brain is the living head, the skull is the caput mortuum. You'll notice that paragraph 328 ends with some discussion by Hegel, actually more criticism by Hegel, of people who are, in his view, being sloppy with language as a reflection of a sloppy consciousness, a sloppy way of thinking that's not using concepts, that's not using the notion, the Begriff, but rather perhaps something like picture thinking or something even lower. He has this nice catchphrase: if one had the notion, if one actually had a grasp on the grasper, the Begriff, then one would have the right word. So it doesn't do any good to say, oh, I've got the notion in my head, but I just can't find the language. If you actually have the notion, you can express yourself adequately to another person so that they can understand what it is that you're saying. They can have evidence that you grasp the concept. So that's sort of at the end of 328, and he's going to say that this is, incompetence and deceit, fancy and pretending one has not the right word, and hiding from oneself that really one has failed to get hold of the thing itself, that is not worked through the notion. Now, a little bit earlier in that paragraph, he's going to say, even if we put the notion aside, you can see that this proposal is not going to work. So let's take a look then at that proposal. First thing to point out is that there's kind of a two-sidedness here, right? We've got spiritually organic being, which is part of what we were just talking about in the previous paragraphs. The spiritual individual is this fluid dynamic system, and not fluid dynamics, right, but fluid and dynamic. And it's corporeal insofar as it's causal, but it's not in essence corporeal, as in the sense of being reducible to configurations of matter. There's more going on there. And then Hegel says, look, it expresses itself, naturally in a way that's objectifiable. He says it has the necessary aspect of an inert, enduring substance. So he says, the former qua the extreme of being for self must step back and have this latter as the other extreme against it, which is then the object on which the spiritually organic being acts as cause. So we've got passive, we have active, right? We have spiritual, we have corporeal. And so we've got these two polarities there that are connected together. Now, he says, if the brain and spinal cord together constitute that corporeal being for self of spirit, we saw that the brain, the spinal cord, the nervous system, that part, is what allows that reflexivity, right? Hegel is interested now in determining what of this mess here in the center we're going to use to talk about where spirit is really doing stuff. And now he's doing it for his own sake. He's also doing it in order for us to help understand the physiognomist and ultimately the phrenologist. So he's doing it in part because he thinks that this is onto something. He's also doing it in part because he thinks these people, the phrenologist and physiognomist, are going to go along partly the right way and then screw things up. So we have to see where we're going with this. So Hegel is going to, you might say, strip off different alternative things that could be the organ. So he says, the brain and the spinal cord together constitute that being for self of spirit. The skull and vertebral column form the other extreme to it, an extreme that is separated off, the solid, inert thing. So we can draw a line here, right? This is part of that inert, enduring existence. The skull, right? The spinal column. The stuff that protects it. I mean, your skull does grow, right? Especially when you're a little baby. But your skull isn't doing a hell of a lot other than protecting that, as we say, that gourd inside, right? So he goes on and he's going to say, look, the skull, it's not an organ that is doing something in terms of consciousness. This is a little bit later. We're going to come back to the discussion of the spinal column in a moment. He says, the skull, was taken for the aspect of outer existence. We can certainly experience teaches that, as it is with the eye qua organ that we see, it's not with the skull that we do intellectual things like murder, steal, write poetry. You might say, well, murdering and stealing aren't really intellectual things. Well, they sure are, because you actually have to do a lot of thinking, at least some thinking, in order to do them. And it's not done with the skull. It's done with the brain. The brain is the driver there. The skull is just the protector, right? The helmet, you might say. And so he says, that's the reason why we must refrain from using the expression organ for that significance of the skull, which still has to be mentioned. What is that significance of the skull that still has to be mentioned? What phrenology is going to be doing, looking at the bumps on your skull and trying to deduce things about what's inside based on what's going on with the outside. So he says, going back now to the spinal column, here's kind of an interesting observation. So we've already cut off the skull and the vertebral column, the bones. We don't really need those at this point in order to talk about this reflexive dynamic of spirit being for itself. What about the spinal cord? So he says, whenever one thinks of the proper location of spirit's outer existence, it's not the back, right? Well, that's where your spine goes. It goes all the way down to your butt, essentially. It's not your back that we tend to think of, but rather the head. So he goes on, he says, in examining a way of knowing like the one we're now dealing with, what is that? Phrenology and physiognomy. We can be satisfied with this reason. Not a very bad reason, but in order to confine this existence to the skull. Should it occur to anyone to think of the back as the location of spirit, insofar as by it knowing and doing are no doubt sometimes partly driven in and partly driven out, this would be no proof at all. The spinal cord must be taken as included in the indwelling seat of spirit. Where is it that spirit is doing its thing? It's not in the spinal column. In a certain way, you could say the spinal column is just a very complex cluster of nerves. Your spinal column is not doing the thinking for you. Now you can say, yeah, what about people who are born with just, the brain stem and not the brain? Okay, the Hegel would probably go along with you on that. But they're not doing a hell of a lot. They're not living anything like a human life in the sense of being self-aware, being reflexive, taking positions on themselves. As far as we know. I mean, maybe there are some, but I don't know of that. So he goes on and he says, in any case, it would prove too much. You may equally recall there's other popular external ways for getting at the activity of spirit in order to stimulate or inhibit it. The vertebral column then is rightly ruled out. If you like. And then he goes on to talk about the skull. So what we can do here is say, it's not the back, whether it be the nervous system or the bones. It's not the bone part of the head. It's the squishy brain part of the head. That is the indwelling seat of spirit. So again, keep in mind that Hegel is interested in this not only for its own sake, but so that he can follow along with these pseudosciences and say, well, they got this part right, but here's where they're going to go way off into crazy territory. And now he's about to reveal some of that to us in the paragraphs to come.